Hello, everyone. I can see people gradually joining. My name is Octavia Reeve. I'm Associate Director here at Ada, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this double book launch hosted by the Ada Lovelace Institute. In a few minutes, you'll be hearing from Dr. Alison Powell, Associate Professor at the LSE and Director of the Just AI Network, which is supported by the Ada Lovelace Institute and the HRC, and Daniel Greene, Assistant Professor of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. While people are still joining, I'm going to take you through a few housekeeping points. Firstly, please be aware that no attendees will be audible or visible during this event. So we won't be able to speak to you direct, but you can ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please submit questions as they occur to you, and Alison and Dan will build them into their discussion at the end. If you want to tweet along with this event, use @AdaLovelaceInst or @JustAINet, depending on where your loyalties lie. There's a transcriber doing live closed captioning of the event, and you can access those by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we are recording this session and it will be made available on our website. I can see the numbers of people ticking up very gratifyingly. So it just remains for me to say how delighted I am to be here to share with you the launch of these two titles addressing technology and civic engagement. To tell you to look out for discount codes generously provided by the publishers, which will be posted in the chat for those wishing to buy copies, and to hand over to Dr. Dylan Mulvin, Assistant Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and author of his own book, The Cultural Work of Standing In, which is due out this summer. So Dylan, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Octavia. Welcome to this much anticipated event with Dan and Alison, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers as well as moderating a discussion after their brief talks. I've promised to keep my introduction very short. I will just say that I've had the pleasure of working with both of these great scholars in the last 5 years and seeing both of these projects formed and developed. And it's a thrill to see them out in the world and to have read them. As already mentioned, Dan Greene is assistant professor at the University of Maryland's iSchool, but I think of him as a friend and a scholar of labor and the future of work and the future of unemployment. Alison Powell is associate professor of media and communications at the London School of Economics. I think of her as a friend and a great scholar of values and technologies and the city and how we think about the future of all of those things. I am going to hand it over to Dan briefly, but I want to ask you to please submit any questions that come up throughout these talks to the Q&A function, as Octavia mentioned, and I will try to incorporate those into our discussion at the end. And as we've now got a kind of critical mass, I will just say, Dan, please take it away.
Great. Does that look okay, Dylan? Awesome. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning as appropriate. So I'm here to talk about the research in my new book from MIT Press, The Promise of Access, Technology, Inequality, and the Political Economy of Hope, which you too can purchase for 20% off. I think it's in the chat. Yeah. Using the code GREENE20, my last name, at penguinrandomhouse.com. So the book is based on years of field work in different DC institutions that turn the problem of poverty into a problem of technology. Many thanks to the Ada Lovelace Institute for the invitation. I'm delighted to be in conversation with some friends and people I admire here. And many thanks especially to Louise Hickman and Hannah Kitcher for organizing. So I'm going to spend 15-ish, 20-ish minutes introducing the big ideas of my book. And of course, I am a little saddened that this will come at the expense of my favorite thing about ethnographic scholarship, which is telling stories, but hopefully I'll do more of that in discussion. So I want to talk about how we understand this relationship between personal computing and economic security. Why is it that we feel that we must learn to code or else? This political common sense in Gramscian terms is really strong, and I call it the access doctrine. It persists across political parties, geographies, and economic conditions. And it doesn't necessarily work We don't actually have a ton of software engineering jobs, and there probably isn't a skills gap, but it does a great deal of work in those institutions that prepare people for the labor market or care for them as they try to re-enter it. Indeed, in the last 30 years, places like schools and libraries have been completely remade around this proposition that we can solve poverty with technology. Not necessarily because the results are there, nor because librarians or teachers or students and patrons believe in this proposition in their heart of hearts. Nobody has been tricked. But because rather embracing this mission saves institutions that are themselves under threat, overwhelmed by social problems that they face every day while they're perpetually short on money and increasingly short of legitimacy. You know, who needs a library if you've got the internet? It is this process of institutional transformation that teaches us to believe in the power of technology to solve poverty. These coping strategies make racial and economic inequality sensible and navigable, providing a script for individuals and institutions to be heard and recognized. And this is why schools and libraries are starting to walk and talk more like startups. It's why your new library looks like an Apple store. You know, they usually fail in the attempt because obviously poverty is a huge, complicated problem. And libraries and schools just can't be startups, but they have no other options. So these posters started appearing on the DC subway system in those neighborhoods, largely still majority Black, in 2013. And each one declared, "The internet, your future depends on it," next to a photo of a working class Black Washingtonian and their story about using the DC government's digital training resources to get a good office job, often after a career in the service industry. So, you know, one explicitly calls out 20 years as a beautician, and then there's instructions to text for more details. So Sean earned an advanced certification in 6 months. Now he upgrades computer systems for the US Small Business Administration. He uses technology to help people start businesses. So can you. The people in the posters look ahead to their new futures, smiling. New skills, new tools lead to better jobs, ones in which you don't have to work with your hands. But this was not just a matter of bringing single individuals across a digital divide, this gap between those who have internet access and the skills to use it and those who do not. The dream here was bigger. By changing their tools and skills, people could drive the economic growth of the city and change the communities in which they lived. While the language has changed over time, from digital divides to digital inclusion to STEM gaps to the demand that we learn to code, the idea that our future depends on personal computing is at least 30 years old. So Clinton and Gore coined the phrase digital divide and promised to, quote, pass on to our children an information superhighway that will help them live out their dreams. They had regained power for the Democratic Party after a long time in the political wilderness and were overseeing a moment of enormous economic transition in the 1990s. Since the crisis of capitalist profits in the 1970s, the US had largely deindustrialized and was now a service-based economy, with some of the most profitable firms based largely in technology design and technology services. Clinton and Gore presented the 1990s as an era of unlimited economic promise, and they built and regulated the commercial internet in the name of presenting access to opportunities for competition. That's what access meant for them. With communism defeated, the internet would connect everyone to a global marketplace. But poverty persisted, and this gave the lie to that story of unlimited economic opportunity. Wages stagnated, inequality rose, those good tech jobs were not actually that numerous. And Reagan Republicans in the 80s had an easy answer for those people, places, and institutions that were rendered surplus by economic transition, even if it contradicted the promise of morning in America. Lock them up, build cages, stick cops on them. That's how we got the largest prison population in world history. Clinton and Gore got into the White House through a new electoral coalition that took the place of the New Deal working class. You know, on the one hand, they have donors who are largely high-tech, export-oriented capitalists in finance and tech. And on the other hand, they have a kind of an electoral base of white-collar office park professionals. These Atari Democrats resolved the contradiction between unlimited opportunity and exacting punishment at the core of neoliberal poverty policy by presenting the internet as an access point for competition. So those who could not or would not log in or skill up would be handed by the carceral state in an act of economic triage. And this political common sense became so strong that it bridged parties. So Bush II campaigned against consumer internet taxes by arguing that, quote, it's the flow of information and knowledge which will help transform America, and we got to make sure that flow is strong. Obama, of course, inaugurated Computer Science Education Week by imploring students, quote, don't just buy a game, make one, don't just download an app, design one. Ivanka Trump lobbied for education department STEM grants by saying, it is vital our students become fluent in coding and computer science. And of course, our new vice president, in a campaign stop in Des Moines, Iowa in 2019 in a black barber shop, asked two young black women what they were majoring in college, and upon hearing that they were pre-law and poli-sci respectively, said they should learn to code. The internet, your future depends on it, then is not just a story about individual economic destiny, but regional and national economic destinies. And this is the power of the access doctrine, and from it flows new policies, new curricula, new degrees, new jobs, new buildings. There are, of course, some problems with this at a high level. So in the US, at least, the jobs of the future are largely not in software development. The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that most of the job growth over the next decade is in low-wage service work, largely food and healthcare, largely not requiring a college degree. And the economy of the past doesn't, or the recent past doesn't conform to the story either. So labor sociologist Lewin Grusky in 2013 attached occupational skill measurements to returns from this current population survey that we run every 2 years, I believe, in 1979 to 2010. And they found that it was analytic, critical thinking skills that led to the biggest wage payoffs, not the technical skills that are supposedly in demand. Of course, the access doctrine and child concepts like the digital divide or the skill gaps, all this is ultimately unfalsifiable. Even if today's technological training regime doesn't work, there's always going to be a new technology tomorrow. And for those interested in shifting the burden of economic transition to workers, they're always going to ask for new skills. So there's been many people much smarter than me, Peter Capelli, Mark Warschauer, Virginia Eubanks, who have disproved this common sense and shown how complicated the problem of poverty is, but it keeps coming back. It's immune to refutation. So instead, I want to explain why we're stuck in this rut, why this story sticks around. Because it's clear to me that the real lives of everyday poor folks do not conform to this story about defeating poverty through technology. So in 2013, if you had seen those posters in the Gallery Place metro station in DC and you walked upstairs and around the block, you'd see MLK Library here, the central branch of our city's public library system. And for several years, I was really lucky to hang out with Ebony, her boyfriend Sean, and their friends Mia and Josie. They were homeless 20-somethings. They spent almost every day in MLK's computer lab, and the internet was, of course, a very important part of their lives. But it wasn't this, promised land of the future. It was just the present. Sean said that when he first lost housing after he and his dad were evicted, quote, the library became my best friend. And it's where he made friends, where he got online to chat or play games or follow the news coverage of the Occupy DC encampment that he worked on. I was always a computer man, he told me. And there's a whole story in I Was Always a Computer Man. It's a story about Sean's hobbies, his friends, and the welfare and state institutions through which he traveled. He wasn't left behind, as those stories or those posters might have suggested. Rather, he used the PC and the institutions around it to build a rich and varied life and to claim space in a gentrified city that was increasingly hostile to the working and workless poor. Sean was a computer man, an activist, a Black Washingtonian, a homeless man, a boyfriend, a library patron, an artist, much, much more. I Was Always a Computer Man is this humble biographical fact, but it's also a big political statement about the security he felt behind a screen in the library. And that security is what he needed most from the library, since it couldn't give him housing, nor should it. That's not the library's job. And he largely ignored all the digital training opportunities around him because he knew they wouldn't work for him. The library, of course, leaned into the city's version of the access doctrine instead. The internet, your future depends on it. As they did so, there was less and less room for people like Sean. There's, of course, a million wonderful things going on in the library, from Spanish conversation partners, dance classes, healthcare signups, video visitation for prison. But over time, the mission narrows to focus on the access doctrine. And we know that the neoliberal turn really punished cities and the institutions in them, like schools and libraries. It pitted them against each other for limited profits, and they were managed by these austerity-minded politicians. DC's libraries were no different. They faced decades of underinvestment and political abuse. In 2015, they employed fewer people at more branches than they had in 1975 when they opened. The central branch, MLK, was desperately overdue for a renovation that would cost hundreds of millions. But it was also functionally the largest homeless shelter in the city. And librarians did not have the training to deal with the fact that their 150 computers were filled every day, not with entrepreneurs on the move, but with homeless folks, largely older Black and Latino men who were largely reading and resting and socializing in really one of the last public spaces in the city. And during the course of my fieldwork in 2012 to 2015, the library, like the charter school that I compare it to, I believe you call them academies in the UK, increasingly embraced technology provision and training and the access doctrine that went with it as their mission. This drew resources and legitimacy. Those maker spaces and training centers that they opened proved that they deserved the renovation. But it also made their complicated jobs a lot simpler. Librarians were always unsure about whether they needed to kick out people who were sleeping in the library or watching porn. They might not have another space to do it. The library is there to provide people with resources. But this new mission provided them with clarity, because if someone wasn't using the digital resources that the library provided professionally, like they would in an office, then they didn't belong. So librarians and the special police unit dedicated to the library, armed police for those outside the US, increasingly cracked down on sleepers, porn watchers, drug sales, food, loud conversations, etc., and made more and more room for the startups and new technologies that would be at the heart of the new library. This mission to extend access and save the unconnected or unskilled is deeply felt by helping professionals like librarians and teachers. They want to help. At the same time, the structural pressures of austerity are difficult to dislodge, and the institution itself is limited in what services it can provide. We ask more of schools and libraries than they can do. So the pressures are very real. The mission is personal and the prospects are dim. And this leads to a process of constant technological and organizational experimentation that I call bootstrapping. It is a hopeful but frantic process pursued because it garners the institution resources, legitimacy, and clarity to its many competing demands. There's new personnel, like these young white librarians who replaced Black unionized veterans, new initiatives, new curricula, new technologies, new renovations, constant experimentation in the name of access, all dedicated towards reaching the ideal of those organizations and people who inspire helping institutions, but who themselves have little need of those institutions, startups and techies. These institutions, like schools and libraries that are tasked with what Marxist feminists call social reproduction, that generally unprofitable work of making people with specific skills and dispositions for a specific economy, has been overtaken by this bootstrapping institutional culture since the 1990s. And this is why we feel that we have to learn to code, or else. Because those institutions that teach us how the economy works and how we fit into it, that help us get into or re-enter the labor market, they themselves are seeking survival strategies. And this is really the only one that's worked. So what convinces them of this common sense? In the book, I draw on organizational sociology, specifically neo-institutionalist theory, to compare MLK Library with a STEM-focused charter school I call Du Bois, in order to formalize the mechanisms behind bootstrapping. So what causes these repeated attempts to solve poverty with technology? Why do libraries or schools end up looking like Apple stores in the process? There's three overlapping pathways. First, a meritocratic model. So middle-class helping professionals, majority white and plurality Black DC, believe that the skills training that led to their labor market success is broadly replicable. They worked hard, went to school, picked the right skills, got good jobs. Even if they knew, in the abstract, that much organizational and individual success is owed to structural factors or luck, their professions mobilize their career pathways as a tool for uplift. and the helpers help the helped on their terms. That's what I do as a teacher in the classroom. Second, technological professionalization. Here, bridging organizations present active professionals or professionals in training with tech sector models. The examples of startups and techies is made readily available, and in some cases must be followed to secure grants or other resources, especially from tech-led philanthropies like the Gates Foundation. iSchools, information schools, now train librarians alongside database engineers. Places like Teach for America and the Broad Institute train new teachers and administrators and network existing ones by importing business language into schools. The top 3 education officials in DC government are all Broad Institute alums. Finally, mission ambiguity. Attacks on institutional finances and legitimacy and the collapse of other non-carceral portions of the welfare state leaves these institutions overwhelmed and under-resourced. Solutions are unclear. Focusing on skills training and tech provision makes complex problems simpler, and it demonstrates activity to powerful stakeholders who might relieve pressure on the organization by, for example, funding a long overdue renovation. And this may seem like kind of a grim story, but by way of conclusion, I just want to say that what I saw in the library over time was both patrons and librarians chafing under, and at the school as well, chafing under the terms of this bootstrapping project that sought to remake the institution and remake the terms of social reproduction. Any change in the mode of production will be accompanied by a change in how we prepare people for it. And I do see a hopeful path forward if those people can come together at that site. Both need each other because the workers occupy a strategic position in order to shut down the institution, but they cannot do so without the political support and the resources provided by the community around them, who are also desperate to save that institution. This fight lost in DC. Librarians did not have nearly the power necessary to make the closure go their way, and instead homeless folks who were patrons there were shunted to the very edge of the city in an industrial park. But there are wins that have looked like this in previous library strikes throughout history in the US. I love this picture of librarians in Contra Costa. If you can't read the placard in the front, it says, "My loyalty are to people, not institutions." And the strategy of social justice unionism, of organizing at the point of reproduction with your students and community members, has been pursued to great success by teachers' unions in the US over the last couple of years, especially in Chicago, but with a massive wave, even including deeply conservative states like West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona in 2018. The process is there, and we can, join together to use these places as kind of staging grounds to recover our institutions and begin a broader fight for economic and technical justice that expands our imagination of what we can be beyond these narrow terms for competition, because these are all coping strategies to resolve inequality, not to resolve inequality, but to manage it. And we can do better. We can imagine different libraries, different schools, different tools, different people, a different economy, but there is quite a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Me and clapping for your talk. I'm going to move right on to Alison's talk, presenting her brand new book, almost available in the United Kingdom, Undoing Optimization. Look at that. Look at that. Dan's already got his copy. And Alison, I'll let you share your screen.
Cool. I'm really pleased to be here. This is fantastic. I'm also a little nervous because this is my first book talk, and my book is so new that it's not even really available in the UK. So that's exciting. Thank you so much to Louise for organizing this. Thank you, Dan, for being a fantastic interlocutor. And it's really my pleasure to sort of talk through the important threads that I'm sketching out in my book, which is about the kind of history and future of the interconnection between technology and civic action. So today I'm going to talk about three important threads in the book. And as you can see from the cover image, this is a book where, you know, there are different dynamics that are being woven together, and the various threads pick up and cross each other and make this a story of their interrelationships. So today I'm going to talk about 3 of these. And the first thread, which is this sort of big claim that goes all the way through the book, which is that technology-led optimization as a dynamic shapes social life, but is also built on the conditions of social life. And my work is often about technologies of urban systems, but it's also about the ideas that are behind those technologies of urban systems. And so the history of the smart city shows this kind of framework that is produced socially, that is then instantiated in the actual technologies that make up the smart city, and is then reimagined again and built upon to kind of layer the ways that the smart city unfolds. And I think in the sort of second thread about the metaphors that help with this weaving and iterating. And these are both material and social, right? So these technosystemic frames I'm talking about aren't only the ways that we talk about the technologies of our urban spaces, they're also the ways that we build our technologies of urban spaces. And this idea of the kind of metaphor is additive again and kind of constitutive. I noticed in my early work at the sort of in the beginning years of the 2000s that ideas about access to networks were really significant in the framing of the smart city. And then later I kept hearing smart cities talked about as something that had to do with data. And finally, in the last few years, I heard the reference to sort of sensing technologies. And across all of these different kinds of technologies, I heard something of a kind of promise of not only a kind of commercially led vision of networking technology as a product to be purchased or access to be gained by becoming a sort of better consumer citizen. But I also heard something of a kind of promise of a commons, a network commons, a data commons, or a commons of sort of sensed information that could help people to gain voice, speak back, and use technology for their own purposes. So this idea of the promise of the commons gets at something I think that's really important for me in this work. This isn't really about a kind of top-down oppressive frame that comes from the technology industry that oppresses people and means that they have to try to kind of fight back and push back. This is a dynamic that is moving between different kinds of actors, including technology companies, but also activists, civil society organizations, and individuals. And that's where we get to the sort of third theme and thread, which is this idea that there is a kind of other way of thinking through and thinking about these smart cities, which might be something like a kind of solidarity that's born through the friction that's generated in the different ways that these technologies, imaginaries, and possibilities are taken forward. So making a data commons, for example, does not completely address the logic that underpins the push to use data to express your citizenship through data. So this is a sort of historical story, and it began for me when I was doing my PhD work, when I started to notice that there was this idea of a kind of networked citizenship that was built up through the 1990s and into the 2000s. And again, sort of recapitulated itself with much of the same language about a kind of responsible data citizenship that came around 2010, in some cases a little earlier, that suggested that citizenship was also, could also be enacted by acquiring public data and processing it and speaking back to the state in that way, or by generating data that couldn't be generated in other ways. I'm wondering, and you'll see in the rest of the talk that what I start wondering about the future is whether this kind of, historical movement is now really embedding us into this idea of ourselves as sensing citizens who don't just acquire data, but have to interpret the world. And I think there's an opening in this idea of sensing that isn't necessarily present in the sort of previous historical patterns. And I want to explore that a little bit as we go on. So to start with this idea of networked citizenship, I think of this as a kind of notion of a connected individual engaging with the city and enabled by connectivity. And I interpret this sort of rise of the kind of mythos of the networked citizen to be kind of bound up in somewhere in between the notion from Manuel Castells of the idea of the network society, the network as a new pattern for relationships that was different than the firm, different than the hierarchy, and the rise of the commercial internet, which arrived at more or less the same time historically. And the rise of networked citizenship was also accompanied by a great explosion of interest in ways that that citizens could use connected technologies to acquire information and therefore be good citizens in relation to the state, or to actually share information in ways that might kind of move past or beyond the way that the state was playing a role. And of course, networked citizens also became very significant consumers of things like internet connectivity. So internet connectivity became a kind of must-have for any sort of city that wanted to brand themselves as smart. And in the book, I spend a long time talking about my fieldwork in a small city in Canada called Fredericton, which was one of the first places to kind of brand itself as a smart community by virtue of the fact that it had installed free Wi-Fi to cover its downtown core. What is interesting about this kind of metaphor of the network is that it doesn't really go in one direction. At about the same time as the small city of Fredericton was trying to figure out how to brand itself as a smart community and become attractive to business people who could gain access to the internet and to information in its downtown, there were activists in places like Berlin and Athens and hundreds of other cities all around the world who were building their own internet access networks. Most of them by Wi-Fi, not always, but these were being built in a kind of radically distributed way that used the idea of networking together as a kind of gloss for a different kind of political orientation. So the map that you see with the red dots and lines is a map of Berlin, where access to the internet was very difficult to get up until about 2010. For various reasons having to do with the separation of the city during the war, and also just the infrastructural upgrades that needed to occur. So a lot of activists were really interested in both the notion of the commons and also in this idea of kind of cooperative living and cooperative work, got together to experiment to see if they could make their own internet access networks. And so some of these networks used connection points to the public, what they called the public internet, and extended them. And some of them just connected up other different buildings. So each of the dots in this map is a building. And the network here was a sort of metaphor for the community's capacity to get together and to actually cooperate. And there's some very interesting detail in the book about the extent to which community engagement and maintenance of this network was actually what created the social network that made all of this possible. The other map is a map of Athens with a lot of blue and yellow dots and green lines that, that apparently link them all, which was another community network that was created by some very radical anarchist activists in Athens. And this was a really interesting example of the sort of obverse of the first one. Lots of connectivity, very little connection to the internet. And basically this network acted as a way for the activists to build pirated versions of the main networking services that at the time were running over the commercial internet, because these were too expensive to access. So they created huge libraries of pirated movies and then distributed them across this local network that they had built using radio technology from rooftop to rooftop. And so I think it's really interesting to see how this model of communicative or networked citizenship links together strong demands for interpersonal cooperation with claims and assumptions about the capacity of technology to mirror or even transform organizational forms like the community or the network. So what do networks make possible? Once you have access to the internet, and once it's no longer something that people have to create alternatives to, it simply falls into the background. And you start to have a big data optimized city where connectivity is everywhere. The network becomes the backdrop and precondition for the next mode of technologically framed citizenship and what it valorizes, which is data exchange. Like, for example, the data exchange that makes the Urban Engines product, which is now part of Google Maps, work. And this, which is part of our everyday life, is the kind of technology that makes it possible for you to click on a route planning application in Google Maps and see what is the most optimal route along your commuting path. The data that you get shows you how to make a more efficient and optimal journey in terms of your time, or if you'd like to avoid a particular place that you don't want to go through. And it also generates data that is sent to the Transport Planning Authority, who then makes plans for how to optimize the overall use of the transport network. So here, producing data that can then be processed becomes a kind of act of good or ideal citizenship. And we see this not only in commercial applications like route planning, which of course is a huge moneymaker for Google Maps and was such a moneymaker for Urban Engines that they were acquired for a very high price. We also see it in intermediaries like Fix My Street, or for those of you in the US, Click Fix, which render civic action into a sort of series of data optimized interactions with a data processing intermediary. So here, all of the sort of the detail of civic life, particularly civic problems like an unpainted crosswalk or scattered leaves, become data points that can be captured, forwarded, and actioned. So again, this is a kind of capture mode. It is a processing. The intermediary does a kind of data processing. In this case, it's described and visualized as messages that are sent to particular people within City Hall, and then to sort of field staff who sends a note back to say, we have collected the scattered leaves. So this optimizes the relationship between the government and the people who are interested, capable, and have enough spare time to identify all of these moments. But this relationship cannot account for the views of people who have not used the platform. On one level, these people might be excluded from access to communication networks, but in another level, their failure to submit data to a platform system that will calculate it into something that would optimize government's work just removes those people from consideration as potentially good citizens. So is there another way we could think about this? Well, we could think about the potential for a civic data commons, or we could start thinking about how a civic data commons might be built up around things like sensing data. So I have two little stories to tell here, and a bit like Dan, I have been remiss in my capacity to tell as many ethnographic stories as I wish. My book travels all around the world to many small places. But the stories I want to tell here are about the ways that data can be a technical material for modeling different ways of collaborating, and the ways that data and sensing can identify frictions. So on the right-hand side, we have a poster of an activist who's working with 596 Acres in New York City. I don't want to say too much about this organization, but just to say that one of the things that makes them interesting as a sort of model for data commons is that they are not interested in collecting data or acting on data. What their project does is transform data into space. So this project has for a very long time been using open data from New York City to identify places where there's vacant land that has not yet been developed. And one of the things that they did early in the project was to use this kind of data about land that was not developed to encourage people to make other use of that land so that the land could become communally valuable and useful and taken out of consideration for development. And I think this is a really interesting way of kind of identifying how do you act in a way that doesn't make sort of civic action reducible to data. The other story I want to tell about the commons is a little bit more contested. One of the chapters in the book looks at a project in Bristol in the west of England that used sensing technology to try to sense when people were living in damp houses. And this project created a lot of sort of sensing data that they wanted to put together in commons. And when the project built a data commons, which is actually a place where all this data was sitting, one of the main things that occurred was that people really disagreed about what this data meant. So they had some data that had been collected from sensors that were supposed to be telling people whether their houses were damp. They had some data that was demographic data, and they had some other data that had been given to them by the city government. And there was a huge amount of contestation about how this data should be interpreted, who it belonged to, and who was able to act on it. There were local entrepreneurs who wanted to use the damp sensing data and the damp sensors that this pilot project created as a sort of form of as the basis for a new business. There were landlords who wanted to install damp sensors in their tenants' buildings and change the rent based on whether or not they were reporting. And so this takes me to a kind of overall question that I have around the smart city, which is what knowledge is visible and what is invisible in a smart city? So who does sensor data speak on behalf of, for example? If damp sensing information speaks on behalf of tenants, does it also speak on behalf of landlords? And what kind of governance knowledge is visible or invisible within a smart city? Most of you will be familiar with Sidewalk Toronto, which was Google's parent company Alphabet's project to redevelop the portlands of Toronto with a sort of sensor-based smart city concept where everything that you did on the land would be tracked, transformed into data, and then managed to create a kind of optimal living environment. The project failed, but not for these technological reasons. The project failed because the governance of the data was at stake. They wanted to create a data trust controlled in the interest of the company, and activists in Toronto persuaded the government that this was not going to be an acceptable way of using Torontonians' data. So perhaps this means that we need to have a kind of principle that allows us to explore our different kinds of solidarity through friction. As soon as our perspective narrows and as soon as the problems of the smart city become singular rather than multiple, the power that collects around technosystems thinking grows. And the only way to contend with this is to resist the individualization and remain in contact with difference and contention, We can see how this happens in social movements, for example, in climate change activism. This has to do with scale, but it also has to do with capacity, the capacity to act, but also the capacity to interpret data, to be able to network, and to mobilize sense. So I'm going to close with a couple of photographs of the commons that I live within and around. And this is my daughter. In one photograph, she's on one of the commons that's recently been produced in our neighborhood, which is a series of closed off streets. They're called low traffic neighborhoods. These transform the streets into spaces without cars. In the second one, she's picking berries in the community fruit patch. What's really interesting about these two commons is that neither of these is without tension. Neither is stable. Who is on the street and who is not? Who is planting the fruit, watering it and tending it, and who is picking it and eating it? These commons have frictions. And so where I want to finish is that I think both of these provide us with ways and means to negotiate these frictions and to model different ways of valuing and knowing the kinds of cities that we live in. Thank you. That's all.
There you go. Thank you,
Sorry.
Alison, and we'll take an opportunity wherever you are to give you a round of applause as well. Fantastic. We have just about half an hour for a discussion, and I think as anybody who wasn't already familiar with your work will have just seen, there's just an absolute abundance of resonances and overlaps and echoes between your two projects. And so I think this is such a great opportunity to put them into communication. So now would be a good time, if you haven't already, to add your questions to that Q&A section. I'll do my best to synthesize some questions as well. But I wanted to start off by asking you to a question about scale, and I think a question about maybe institutions, right? And I mean, I'll say that for anybody who hasn't yet had the chance to read these two brand new books, the books are full of really rich ethnographic detail, right? Stories of human struggle and organization and kind of the grain of everyday life and community building and community organization. Right? But so much of our discourse around technology and society, right, is dominated by macro level discussions, right? Corporations, states, and even a kind of mass of users, right? On the other hand, we might talk about kind of micro scale anecdotes, right, of our personal experience of, say, social media or citizenship, or exclusion or inclusion. But most people will encounter their world through really meso-level experiences of local institutions, schools, libraries, community organizations, housing associations. And I think that that's one of the ways that your books really resonate with each other, right? They're both about that level of experience, which is really where you meet people in their lives. So I wonder if you could talk about what that scale means to you in the way that you approach your work, and how it bears on these questions of technology and society and justice.
Thank you, Dylan. I guess we can go in order again if we want, but and thank you, Alison. That was really lovely. For me, it was when I started this book, or which was the dissertation in a different form, God, a decade ago. I had thought it was a comparative ethnography of the digital divide. I thought I would be talking to rich people in the city and poor people in the city, and I'd say like, okay, what are your different relationships to your computer? And I would be, writing it's almost a kind of a development HCI kind of thing, at that level of individual usage where structural changes kind of pop up and change how you use things. But it became pretty clear that I was instead looking at this institutional story that became an institutional ethnography over time, because I was really interested in how people came to learn these lessons and how they circulated between different spaces. So a big part of what I try to do is show how even in just one city, and I'm sure it's similar in your guys' cities too, the ideas and people and resources rotate between powerful businesses on the kind of leading edge of the economy and these institutions of social reproduction that often get like ignored or punished politically, but are, we cannot survive without. I think the pandemic has absolutely revealed that the social fabric gets crushed without regular schooling. Libraries ditto, like because there really is no other kind of public space around in our cities. So I needed to follow that, and it became that kind of story. And I think one of the conceptual things that I try to unpack is how changes move up and down the scale. And we're usually used to moving down. And that's a big part of like the history I tell, is that there's this moment of economic and political transition that gives us, on the one hand, this kind of laissez-faire moment where everyone has to train up to access the jobs of the future. And on the other hand, if you don't play by the rules, we have the largest, meanest carceral state in human history to push you around for it. And then that filters down into policy decisions that individual cities make, because cities are competing with each other for limited resources, which filters down into the institutions in those cities that must be remade if they are to attract new capital, especially tech capital. So the city must be remade in startup's image if it is to become a creative city. So in many ways, this is kind of like the social reproduction version of these startup ethnographies that people like Gina Neff or Alice Marwick have told about how those places drive the tech industry. And I want to show how the rest of the city changes in response. That then filters down into how what computers you get assigned, how your school manages your Wi-Fi password, whether or not someone can sleep at the library, these very small things. And what I hope by talking about organizational change and these possibilities for political action at the end of the book and the end of this talk is that we can then think about ways to filter change back up strategically, because there are lots of different institutions in which we find ourselves, but not all of them are going to be as amenable to the fight. In the 30s, the labor movement chose specific fights for specific reasons because they were strategically important. And I think the same is true today. Like I really do believe that it is the fight in our schools, libraries, hospitals, clinics, these sites of social reproduction. I really think that is where our best shot is for taking power. And that is ultimately my biggest concern.
Thanks, Dan. That's so I have some kind of resonant comments as well. I also started out, this was a long time coming, so there are bits and pieces from my dissertation in here as well, maybe like, filtered through a whole decade of moving across the world and encountering a whole lot of different contexts, and then not really being able to do an ethnography that's in one place, but desperately hoping that there were these sort of projects that would show me that there was like a different way to imagine what was going on. So I wouldn't have to write a book that was just about how corporations have reprogrammed cities. And it was extremely difficult to actually find what I was looking for. And in the end, I found something a little messier, as we always do, which is that there weren't straightforward places where people were straightforwardly opposing the kinds of dynamics that were introduced by adding a database layer over top of a city or trying to effectively manage traffic. For example, the book opens with me trying to cross the road with my daughter, which I'm still trying to cross the road. Same road, still trying to cross the road. It's still not optimal for me as a person. But trying to cross the road is a good metaphor for what I did end up being able to describe in the book, which is that there are multiple dynamics that are moving in different directions at the same time in the same place. So to answer your original question, Dylan, the way that I see scale is that I don't think that scale necessarily needs to be the framework. I don't think we're moving from small to big or from big to small. I think we're actually moving along and in between many layers of relationships. And the issue with optimization is that you are being narrowed into perhaps one layer and then being able to unable to see the connections between the layers that would make it possible to act in different ways to support the different things happening on those different layers.
Thank you both. I'm going to synthesize a couple of questions here from our audience. And I think this is more or less oriented towards Alison, your discussion of the commons, but Dan, feel free to weigh in. And so the first question is about how an appeal to the commons presumes an inevitability of technological transformation and maybe the desirability of that transformation. And a question to go along with that is, comes from the turn towards optimization of civic action, which then becomes a kind of resource. So I wonder, Alison, if you could talk about, in response to this question, you know, what we do with the desirability of that vision of the commons and how it might be inseparable from technological change, which obviously resonates with Dan's discussion of a kind of access doctrine as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can start and then I'll sort of try to open some avenues for you, Dan, as well. I mean, the idea that technological transformation is inevitable is really at the heart of this kind of like thinking about the city as needing to fit into a kind of techno-systemic frame or to follow this kind of techno-systemic pattern. And it's maybe the ideological driver of all of the conditions that I have been studying. I don't believe that there is any kind of inevitability in technology itself. What I find fascinating about this notion of the commons as a space for an alternative is that it is accompanying the kind of, it's kind of embedded within this techno-systemic frame as that expands itself. So I don't know, I think this is from Mustafa. Thanks for coming, by the way. I don't know whether this desire to think about this, this kind of commons as a space for reimagining technology is necessarily connected to that technological change itself. I think it might be deeper and older and then coming out as a kind of response to this assumption of inevitability, but it's now captured, it's now kind of tied up and within it. And I think it is constraining. It's also it's enabling, of course. It's constraining because it's still working along the same terms that it is kind of presuming an alternative to. And that is also to do with this idea of the resource, you know, thinking about optimization in terms of resources. And was this Norcha's question? Also, thank you for coming, Norcha. And this kind of, that is also about acting, like this invitation to constantly be acting and constantly be making something into the resource. So you have to create the data. You can't just take the train. You have to also then create the data that becomes the resource for, you know, for the city government. And this makes refusal seem a potentially more interesting direction than commons, but I did not encounter very much discussion of refusal. And I wonder if that's because I was looking for people who wanted to engage with the kinds of technological changes. I'm going to let Dan respond to these as well.
Yeah, I think that, you know, Mustafa is right that we need to be wary of like words concepts that travel between all these different spaces. Like, I think like, you know, I greatly admire Ostrom's work on the commons, and it is like very important to say that this like so-called tragedy of the commons that drives so much kind of libertarian economic reform is a myth, and it's just not how the world actually works. The commons was always held together by care. But nonetheless, the commons is something that you find people on multiple conflicting sides of the political issue embracing. And when people who are like natural enemies in other spheres come together on and agree on one thing, that always, you know, makes me nervous for whatever reason. I think as a matter of political strategy, I think it's agnosticism regarding the technology is really important, and realism. So I'm thinking about this paper last year from Ben Greene and Salome Villain called Algorithmic Realism, that is about algorithmic regulation that doesn't necessarily center the algorithm. And there was a similar conversation in the History of Technology conference from, I think, Eden Medina, but I might be getting that wrong. And the idea is that, you know, taking whatever the, you know, normative political stance that you want at may or may not involve attacking directly the technology that is at the center of debate, at the center of focus of the people in power, at the center of focus of so much governmental reform, because it just may not be friendly terrain. And, you know, there are so many beautiful social connections that are born even in this unfriendly terrain. So many opportunities for communication and solidarity and connection across difference. And that is truly one of the most amazing things about the time in which we live. But not all of them are going to be grounds on which to build power and take back your city. Some of them are going to be satisfying and fun and fulfilling, and they will energize you back after a long day where you've been shut down. But that doesn't mean they're amenable to a fight. So the question for me is always, what is, you know, strategically valuable, what allows you to build power and solidarity with people who are different from you but suffering from the same problem. I love the discussion of solidarity towards the end of Alison's book. And that may be the commons, it may be data, it may have absolutely nothing to do with data, because those are their tools and not yours. So for me, it's always this conversation about like pragmatic political strategy rather than necessarily taking the opportunity presented to you by power.
Thank you. The next question is, well, it comes from me. And this is a question about access, right? And I mean, access is right there in the title of Dan's book, but it developed thoroughly throughout the book in terms of the access doctrine. And Alison, your story about responsible network citizenship or data citizenship, I think relies on a kind of similar fantasy of access, right? Sometimes called connection, but access to the network, right? Access to the commons through networked technology. But access is obviously a term with many, many valences and constantly fought over in different domains. So last week here at the virtual Ada Lovelace Institute, we had a fantastic event about access and accessibility in terms of disability rights, design, and politics. So I wonder if the two of you could talk a little bit about what access as a term is doing in your work, and what you might be offering a discussion of access or accessibility in terms of the complicating or clarifying the political stakes of access.
I would say first that there are many different stories of access. Some of them are empowered more than others. And in the US context, at almost the end of Clinton's term in 2000, there were even more cuts for our disability insurance program on the table, and big debate over work requirements for Medicaid. And these were justified via access, via saying that, it's so easy to find work opportunities behind a computer. You don't even need to get out anymore. why not work test people for disability insurance? Why not lower the payment? Because, flush labor market, the line will obviously continue to go up. There will be jobs for everybody. There's opportunity for competition all around us. And that did not have to be how that story was told. And indeed, in the 90s and early 2000s, there were powerful other visions, especially in like developmentalist states, like the Lula government in Brazil had a very different idea of what digital divide and access meant compared to what was going on in the Clinton regime. And this was in part because they built these technological outreach programs into community centers, internet cafes, and public health centers that were kind of designed as community outposts that the US just does not have. We didn't even really have internet cafes as like a public space for using the internet. We really just have libraries. And libraries have had to take on many of these jobs, but they don't have the resource or training for it. So the story I tell is that there are lots of other visions for what access could mean. And I show that like in the library, patrons make other libraries. They make places to play and have fun and watch porn and repair each other's machines and share resources. Same thing in schools. Students found out all of these ways to like get around the internet filters and provide, communicate like in secret about protests they were planning and stuff like that. There's like all these different ways of accessing the institution, but the vision that gets imposed on these institutions is the one that they need to do in order to survive. So it's this common sense that doesn't necessarily work. It kind of gets pieces from the rest of social reality, but it's the one that becomes acceptable, not because you're tricked, but it's because the story you have to tell to get recognized and heard. So there's lots of visions, but one probably matters more than others.
So when I think about access, I think about like the actually expertise, which is another really big piece, and part of this idea of who gets to be a good citizen under these kinds of conditions. And I would also just like to say, I agree with you, Dan, that like data is not everyone's tool. What I was really trying to understand is to what extent can people make it their tool? And I think there's a lot of like contingencies in the book because it is really difficult to try to make someone else's tool your tool. And as soon as you start speaking with the material that is provided to you by like someone else, in this case, all of these networking companies who actually also recapitulate this narrative of good citizenship that changes over time. And Cisco installed all the routers that I studied in the first part of the book, and then they decided that they were going to pivot and become kind of sensor-based smart city providers in the second part of the book. Is it possible to do that kind of work and use someone else's tools, and someone else's tools that are actually defined by all of these dynamics of power? Well, if you're going to do that, then you actually do need to be expert. And that is a really big part of this kind of question of who is able to act as a good citizen. And I talk quite a lot about open data movements and how open data movements created this kind of like activist expert who was able to sort of work with government data, which is often extremely bad quality, published in a PDF. You have to manipulate it a lot. And then you also have to try to figure out if this can be, in fact, placed in a different context to allow to make it possible to be used for sort of civic ends. And there's a really interesting anecdote that comes out of some field work that we did with open data activists in Bath, also in the west of England, where they got really concerned about how much they were what their analysis of government buildings electricity use might show. And they said, if we publish that some government buildings have their electricity use that is high all the time, we might inadvertently give fuel to people who want to criticize the government, when in fact that building might actually be a back office where they need to run servers all night long. And so there was this real sort of contingency that these experts had to negotiate in order to try to do good with data. And there was also this very interesting pipeline where many of them got pulled into working for the government after doing open data work that was actually sort of, potentially critiquing the government using government data. So I realize we only have 5 minutes, so maybe we should go and ask some more questions.
So we've got a question here about surveillance. So Julia asks, at the risk of techno-determinism, one thing that does seem somewhat inevitable, right, about smart cities, and I would say I would include here the kind of smartification of schools and library spaces that Dan describes as well. But inevitable that about smart cities is that someone at some point will co-opt them for surveillance, as in the landlord and dampness example. Can you comment on this co-optation and whether it has more to do with tech affordances or broader socio-political systems, and what that might have to do with any possibilities for kind of change and resistance?
Yeah, I mean, surveillance is sort of built into the idea of the smart city. And I decided not to look at surveillance because there has been so much good work on sort of surveillance and the logic of smartness as a kind of justification for surveillance. I think also being a kind of like irrepressible optimist, I was secretly hoping that I would find like many more obvious examples of kind of like alternative constructions, partly because the alternative network constructions of the sort of, the community Wi-Fi age were actually really spectacular. And many of them were also appropriated in various different ways, but some of them were like very radical. Arinma also asked about motivations to participate in those. And some of the motivations were like, I just don't want to have anything to do with any commercial, networking companies. And I just want to build a completely radical decentralized network because I believe that all social relationships should be decentralized. And I want to model that in a technology. So I was kind of hoping that I would see more of this kind of like really like radical appropriation. And I saw things that were much more subtle than that kind of radical reappropriation. And I actually wonder, I think I concluded that was because by the time you get to this kind of like thinking about sensing and smartness and the sort of pervasiveness, there's a very big technological stack that has been built. And it's been building up from the network to the kind of database systems, to the sensing systems. So it becomes more difficult to kind of like radically reroute at that point.
Right. Yeah, I don't have an enormous, I mean, there is a lot of surveillance in this book at the point of where people log on, if we still use that phrase anymore, where there's, the library computer lab that I spend so much time in has librarians able to monitor your machine such that if you're watching porn, you get a little pop-up that says, please don't do that. If you're working on a job application and you wave your hand, you might get 20 minutes extra tacked on. School was an intense site of surveillance, both because of what was built into the infrastructure and frankly, because Black and brown children are intensely policed. The police are just an ever-present force in the lives of these kids that I was talking to at school, at home, on play, and that was just kind of one manifestation of it. But I also do a lot more surveillance work outside, on both in academic work on stuff like body cams and as kind of a hobbyist abolitionist in my own area. And I really have started to embrace this idea from Italian workerists like Panzieri and them in the 60s and 70s that technology is a record of class struggle. It's kind of a fossil that preserves where the struggle was at in a certain point of time. And if you are at a disadvantage in that struggle and in the subordinate position, then your perspective and your goals for that design are going to lose out. And if our institutions are primarily being run by moneyed, racist, entrepreneurial optimizers, then yeah, surveillance is going to be embedded into our systems in order to nudge us along into the right course. So I don't see that necessarily as a piece of technological determinism, but as a fact that social conflict is not on some separate plane from technological design, but technological design is a field of social conflict. And one thing that I loved about Alison's book is that it implicitly and explicitly brought back that kind of dimension in the kind of participatory design tradition. That participatory design really started out as a really political space that, in fact, its roots are in the Scandinavian unions. And it has become more a space of like focus grouping different designs to see if that, people like whatever color widget is going to be at the sidewalk in Toronto. And if we take participatory design seriously, then it really means having the people who work in these institutions and the people who benefit from them coming together to say, this is what the institution wants to look like, rather than, choosing preset options on a menu that Capital has laid out before us.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Alison, and thank you everyone for coming to this event. It's been such a joy to share in the launch of these books. And again, I must encourage you wherever you are to find a copy of either The Promise of Access or Undoing Optimization if and when it's available in local bookstores. If there's nothing else, I think we'll say goodbye. Thank you for joining us, and do follow up with the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is hosting nonstop excellent events week to week. So thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.